World War II ended with the unconditional surrender of Japan in September 1945, but for 29 years, a Japanese soldier hid deep in the Philippine jungle and continued waging guerrilla warfare until 1974. This is the story of Hiroo Onoda, a Japanese soldier who refused to believe the war was over for nearly 30 years. Hiroo Onoda joined the Imperial Japanese Army Infantry when he was 18 years old. He was one of many young men sent overseas to serve the Japanese war effort at the time, but Onoda distinguished himself so much so that he has essentially become a legend. Many have heard of his story, but few know the whole story of the soldier who spent decades fighting a war that had ended years before. Onoda was born on March 19, 1922, in the Japanese town of Kamikawa. He came from a long line of warriors, dating back to his samurai ancestors and continuing up to his father, a sergeant in the Japanese cavalry who fought and died in China during the Second Sino-Japanese War. Onoda followed in the footsteps of his forefathers and enrolled in the Imperial Japanese Army at the age of 18, just 1 year before Japan went to war with the United States in the aftermath of the Pearl Harbor attack. Onoda trained as an intelligence officer in the commando class, Futama, at the Nakano School. This military training facility specialized in teaching unorthodox military operations, including guerrilla warfare, sabotage, counterintelligence, and propaganda. Steeped deep in Japanese military tradition was the ancient samurai's Bushido code, or way of the warrior, which above all else stressed courage, self-denial, honor, and loyalty. To surrender was dishonorable, and one should choose death rather than surrender. The skills Onoda gained from his one-of-a-kind training would come in handy when he was deployed to the Lubang Island in the Philippines after his training ended in December 1944. The Imperial Japanese Army had gained control of the Philippines 2 years earlier, ousting the Philippine government and American forces stationed there. Their army, however, was small, and when the United States launched a counter-invasion of the island nation in early 1944, they quickly began pushing back the Japanese. By the winter of 1944, many Japanese troops had been forced out of the Philippines' major islands and had fled to the smaller islands of the Philippine archipelago, such as Lubang Island. Hiroo Onoda was deployed to the small island in December 26, 1944, to implement his guerrilla warfare tactics to hold off American and Philippine troops for as long as possible. Onoda used a strategy that the Japanese had been experimenting with during the Pacific War. When their outposts were on the verge of defeat in conventional battle, they would fall back to the woods to engage in guerrilla warfare. The plan? Keep U.S. troops from establishing firm footholds in the region, thereby delaying their ability to march closer to Japan and giving the Imperial Japanese Army more time to recover and prepare for attacks. These guerrilla troops, which also served as spies, would continue to be a thorn in the side of the Allies. When Hiroo Onoda arrived on the island, the officers who outranked Onoda refused to allow him to carry out his job, preferring instead to combat invading soldiers head-on. As a result, the American troops arrived on the little island on February 28, 1945. The Japanese forces there tried to fight them, but were quickly defeated. When Onoda realized they were about to be defeated, he located 3 of his troops and ordered them into the woods with him to join him in his guerrilla warfare. Onoda would wage his guerrilla warfare for the next 29 years. He and his soldiers relied on stolen rice, coconuts, and meat from livestock slaughtered during farm raids when he wasn't fighting neighboring Philippine forces. As the war between Japan and the United States drew to a close in August 1945, Onoda noticed a break in the combat, but had no idea that his home country had surrendered. As a result, he maintained his private war, killing local farmers and even engaging in shootouts with police when they came after him. Knowing about the existence of these Japanese guerrilla troops who had no way of communicating with the central military leadership, the US took many measures to ensure that word of Japan's surrender reached these holdouts, including airdropping explanatory leaflets. In October 1945, Hiroo Onoda and his soldiers came upon a US leaflet declaring the end of the war and Japan's surrender. However, he immediately rejected the letter as propaganda, something he was well versed in given his training. More leaflets arrived at the end of 1945, carrying a surrender order from General Tomoyuki Yamashita, of the 14th Area Army printed on them. Onoda and his men carefully examined the document before concluding that it too was a fake. Onoda, who had a highly traditional sense of pride, couldn't imagine the Japanese surrendering and believed that they would fight until the last soldier died. As a result, he and his soldiers continued their terror campaign in the countryside, escaping Philippine police and insurgents. Private Ichi Akatsu, one of Onoda's troops, began to realize that the war was done by 1949. He abandoned his regiment and lived by himself for 6 months before surrendering to the Philippine Army in March 1950. The capitulation of Akatsu revealed to the rest of the world the presence of Japanese holdouts in Lubang Island. Armed with this information, the U.S. contacted the holdouts' families, obtaining family photos and letters from their relatives, urging them to return home. Then airdropped these messages over the island in 1952. "We found leaflets and photos from our families," recalled Onoda in a later interview. "I assumed they were living under the occupation and had to obey the authorities to survive." The government then tracked down Onoda's superior officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, who had since become a bookseller, and flew him to Lubang. So, on March 9, 1974, at the age of 52, Hiroo Onoda emerged from the bush, still decked in his ragged official uniform and armed with his service rifle and sword, to accept his commander's order to lay down his arms. Even then, he was unsure and prepared for a trap. But when commanded, he laid down his rifle, 500 bullets, a ceremonial sword, and a sword belt, as well as his dagger in its white box, and saluted his nation's flag. He surrendered his sword to the President of the Philippines and was pardoned for his numerous offenses against the state. He then returned to Japan, where he was hailed as a hero by a euphoric Japanese public. However, Onoda was never at ease with the truth he had discovered about Japan and the new Japan to which he returned. He did not believe that the country should have accepted responsibility for the war in East Asia, and he was outraged that they had allowed the Allied powers to disband their military. Soon after his return, he became involved in politics, advocating for a more militarized Japan. His popularity and the huge changes that had occurred in Japan during his absence made him apprehensive. Unhappy with the state of Japan, he relocated to Brazil in 1975 to start a family and graze cattle on a ranch. He later returned to Japan to establish a nature camp for children, believing that it would help them connect with nature and build positive values. Hiroo Onoda ultimately died of heart failure on January 6, 2014, aged 91. Though he was not the last Japanese soldier to surrender during World War II, he was undoubtedly the most famous and intriguing of these holdouts. That brings us to the end of today's video. If you liked the video, please leave a like and a comment below. Also, if you're new to this channel, subscribe and click the notification bell to get notified when we upload more content. We'll see you guys in the next one.